It usually doesn't begin with something dramatic. There's no thunder, no shadow moving across the wall, no voice from the darkness announcing that a battle has begun. Sometimes spiritual struggle begins quietly, with a thought you can't shake, a temptation that suddenly feels impossible to resist, a fear that wakes you at 2 in the morning, a growing desire to isolate yourself from everyone who loves you. And little by little you begin asking yourself a dangerous question. Why don't I feel like myself anymore? The Bible never tells believers to live terrified, but it does tell them to stay awake. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful." Why? Because Scripture describes the Christian life as a battle. But here's something important. Not every difficult thought, bad day, temptation, nightmare, or emotional struggle means you are under demonic attack. Human beings experience stress, anxiety, trauma, temptation, exhaustion, and mental health struggles. Wisdom means knowing the difference. So don't watch this video looking for something to fear. Watch it looking for something to recognize. Because when you understand the battle, you can respond with truth instead of panic. And there are 5 patterns Christians should be especially careful about. The first one begins with something that looks completely harmless. Sign number 1. Intisman. It rarely arrives looking evil. That's what makes temptation so powerful. It looks attractive, reasonable, convenient, sometimes even deserved. You tell yourself, it's just this once. No one will know. I've had a hard week. I deserve this. Before you realize what's happening, something that once looked wrong suddenly looks normal. James 4:14 says that a person is tempted when they are lured and enticed by their own desire. Notice something important. Temptation often works through desires that already exist inside us. That means you don't need to imagine every temptation as a supernatural event. But you do need to recognize what temptation is trying to accomplish. It wants your attention, because what captures your attention can eventually capture your heart. Maybe it's lust. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's revenge. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's power. Maybe it's the desire to control everyone around you. The bait changes. The strategy doesn't. Get close enough to the temptation, and eventually you start negotiating with it. That's why the answer isn't always to prove how strong you are. Sometimes the wisest spiritual decision is simply to leave. 2 Timothy 2:22 says, "Flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness." Flee. Not negotiate. Not stare at it. Not test yourself. Flee. If an app constantly pulls you towards something destructive, remove it. If a relationship repeatedly leads you towards sin, establish boundaries. If a place continually becomes a doorway to temptation, stop going there. You don't prove your faith by standing next to the fire. Sometimes obedience looks like walking away. And that leads to the second sign. Sign number 2, compulsion. Have you ever said, "Never again," and then found yourself doing the same thing days later? You promised yourself you would stop. You meant it. You prayed about it. You regretted it. And yet the cycle continued. This is where temptation can become a pattern, and patterns can become powerful. Paul described the painful conflict of wanting to do what is right while repeatedly doing what he hated. Romans 7:15 captures that struggle. But here's where you need wisdom. A repeated behavior doesn't automatically mean a demon is controlling you. Compulsion can involve habits, addiction, trauma, stress, mental health conditions, or deeply reinforced behavioral patterns. But spiritually, the response still begins with bringing what is hidden into the light, because secrecy makes destructive patterns stronger. Shame tells you, don't tell anyone. You should be able to handle this yourself. If people knew the real you, they would leave. That's the trap. James 50:16 tells believers to confess their sins to one another and pray for one another. You don't have to announce your struggle to the entire world. Start with one trustworthy person, a mature Christian, a pastor, a counselor, someone who will tell you the truth without destroying you with shame. And when the pattern begins, interrupt it. Stand up. Leave the room. Put the phone down. Call someone. Change the environment. Replace the old routine with a healthier one, because freedom often begins with a decision made before the temptation arrives. You are not your worst habit. You are not your past. And your struggle does not mean God has abandoned you. But if you keep feeding the same pattern Don't be surprised when it keeps growing. Now, the third sign is different, because this one doesn't simply pull you towards something. It wears you down. Sight number 3, relentless pressure. There are seasons when everything seems to happen at once. One problem becomes 3. 3 becomes 5. A relationship falls apart. Work becomes overwhelming. Your sleep gets worse. Your patience disappears. Your prayer life becomes difficult. And you begin thinking, why is everything happening right now? Sometimes life is simply life. Sometimes difficult circumstances have ordinary explanations. But Scripture does warn believers that spiritual opposition exists. 1 Peter 5:8 describes the devil as an adversary who prowls like a roaring lion. The image is powerful. A predator doesn't need to destroy its target in one moment. It can exhaust it. Pressure can make you tired. Exhaustion can make you careless. Carelessness can make you vulnerable. And vulnerability can make a small problem feel enormous. So when life becomes overwhelming, don't immediately assume every problem is supernatural. Instead, step back. Look at the whole picture. Are you sleeping? Are you isolated? Are you carrying responsibilities you were never meant to carry alone? Are you feeding your mind with fear all day? Are you neglecting prayer, community, rest, or healthy routines? And then ask the deeper question. What is this pressure producing in me? Is it pushing you toward bitterness, fear, isolation, hopelessness? Or is it teaching you dependence on God? James 4:7 says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you." Notice the order. Submit to God, then resist. The Christian response isn't panic. It is surrender followed by resistance. And sometimes resistance looks surprisingly ordinary. Turn off the phone. Get some sleep. Open Scripture. Go outside. Call someone you trust. Pray. Ask for help. Return to truth, because protecting your peace isn't weakness. It is wisdom. And then we reach the fourth sign. This one often happens in the darkness. Sign number 4, tormenting Ford. 2 in the morning. The house is silent. Everyone else is asleep. But your mind won't stop. One thought becomes another. Then another. You imagine everything that could go wrong. Your heart races. Your body feels tense. You can't explain why you're afraid. And eventually you begin wondering, why can't I feel God's peace? Fear can become exhausting. And for some people, anxiety, trauma, panic, nightmares, or other mental health struggles can make nighttime especially difficult. That does not mean they are possessed. It does not mean God has abandoned them. And it certainly does not mean they should avoid professional help. But Scripture gives believers a powerful truth to hold on to. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." Fear does not get the final word. When your mind starts spiraling, don't automatically believe every thought simply because it feels intense. A thought can feel real without being true. Say what is true. God is with me. I am not alone. I don't have to solve tomorrow tonight. I can ask for help. I can rest. I can pray. I can breathe. And I can bring my fear to God. Philippians 4:6-7 reminds believers to bring their anxieties to God through prayer and thanksgiving. And if your fear becomes overwhelming, persistent, or interferes with your daily life, talk to someone qualified to help. A pastor can pray with you. A trusted friend can stand beside you. A counselor or doctor can help you understand what is happening. Seeking help isn't a failure of faith. Sometimes wisdom is the answer to prayer, but there is one final danger. And unlike fear, this one can feel completely rational. Sign number 5, discernment. This may be the hardest battle to recognize, because deception doesn't usually sound like a lie. It sounds reasonable. You're not really doing anything wrong. Everyone else does it. God understands. Now, you can change later. You're too far gone now. There's no point trying. You don't need anyone. You don't need church. You don't need prayer. You don't need Scripture. And slowly the lie becomes your normal way of thinking. That's why deception is so dangerous. You can fight something you recognize. But how do you fight something you believe is true? 2 Corinthians 10:5 speaks about taking thoughts captive and bringing them into obedience to Christ. That means Christians are not called to believe every thought that enters their minds. Test it. Examine it. Compare it with Scripture. Ask. Does this thought produce truth? Does it produce humility? Does it lead me toward love? Does it draw me closer to God? Or does it produce pride, hatred, hopelessness, secrecy, and isolation? Because not every voice in your head deserves your agreement. Your emotions are real, but your emotions aren't always accurate. Your fear is real, but fear isn't prophecy. Your temptation is real, but temptation isn't destiny. Your past is real, but your past isn't your identity. And your mistakes are real, but they don't place you beyond God's mercy. John 17:17 says, "Your word is truth." That is why Scripture matters. Truth gives you something solid when your emotions are unstable. Community matters too, because deception becomes stronger when nobody is allowed to challenge you. Find people who love you enough to tell you when you're wrong, not people who simply agree with everything you say. People who will pray with you, correct you, encourage you, and remind you who you are when you forget. So, let's go back to the beginning. 5 signs: enticement, compulsion, relentless pressure, tormenting fear, deception. But don't leave this video afraid. Leave it awake. There is a massive difference. The Christian message is not, be terrified because the enemy is powerful. The message is, be watchful because God is greater. 1 John 4:4 says, "He who is in you is greater than he who is in the world." You don't have to obsess over darkness. You don't have to search every coincidence for a supernatural explanation. And you don't have to live afraid of every difficult thought or difficult season. Instead, stay close to truth. Stay close to God. Stay connected to people who strengthen your faith. Deal honestly with temptation. Bring hidden struggles into the light. Seek wise counsel. And when you are struggling emotionally or mentally, don't be ashamed to seek professional help. Faith and wisdom do not have to compete. Sometimes God brings healing through prayer. Sometimes through community. Sometimes through a pastor. Sometimes through a counselor. Sometimes through a doctor. And sometimes through the simple courage to finally say, "I need help." So, before you leave, ask yourself one question. Which of these 5 passions do you recognize? Maybe it's temptation. Maybe it's a habit you can't seem to break. Maybe you're exhausted from relentless pressure. Maybe fear has been stealing your sleep. Or maybe you've been believing a lie about yourself for so long that you don't even recognize it as a lie anymore. Whatever it is, don't hide it. Bring it into the light. Pray about it. Talk about it. Test it against truth. And take the next right step. You are not your temptation. You are not your fear. You are not your darkest thought. You are not your past. And you are not alone. So stand firm, not because you are strong enough by yourself, but because your strength does not have to come from yourself. And when the battle comes, remember this. You don't have to chase the darkness. You simply have to keep walking toward the light. Because the goal isn't to live terrified of the enemy. The goal is to live so deeply rooted in truth that deception has nowhere to grow. And when fear comes knocking, when temptation whispers, when shame tells you to hide, when your mind tells you that you've gone too far, stop. Breathe. Pray. Open the Word. Reach out to someone you trust. And remember who you belong to. Because the battle may be real, but so is grace. So is truth. So is hope. And according to the promise of Scripture, ask, you are not alone. Ask.